Welcome in to Kicking the Rear podcast. My name is Joe Yarshin. Today on episode 24, we're going to be reviewing one of my all-time favorite books, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. There's over 15 million copies in print. This book is foundational. It is a mindset book. It is applicable to business, real estate, entrepreneurship, and all forms of higher level growth and personal development. So without further ado, let's get into it. There's 14 chapters in this book. Chapter 1 is desire, the starting point of all achievement, the first step toward riches. Typically, I go through each book and I review each section. This time, I'd like to highlight just the sections I've underlined because there was a lot of wordy, drawn out passages here that I can't really break down in a simple way without explaining the entire passage. So I'll kind of just skip over and get into it here. So on page 14, he's talking about an experience he had. He talked about mixing his faith and desire, communicating the desire, and then believing in that sentiment. So in chapter 2, it's titled Faith, Visualization of, and Belief in Attainment of Desire, the second step toward riches. In this section, I circled faith is a state of mind which may be induced by autosuggestion. So he talks about autosuggestion and what that means. Talks about self-confidence and the self-confidence formula. All impulses, to quote here, all impulses of thought have a tendency to clothe themselves in their physical equivalent. I thought that was an interesting quote. Another passage here that I like to read verbatim is, business is due for a reform. Make no mistake about this. The methods of the past based upon economic combinations of force and fear will be supplanted by the better principles of faith and cooperation. Men who labor will receive more than daily wages. They will receive dividends from the business, the same as those who supply the capital for business, but first they must give more to their employers and stop this bickering and bargaining by force at the expense of the public. They must earn the right to dividends. He continues on page 23 to say, moreover, and this is the most important thing of all, they will be led by leaders who will understand and apply the principles employed by Mahatma Gandhi. Only in this way may leaders get from their followers the spirit of full cooperation, which constitutes powers in its highest and most enduring form. So moving on page 28 to round out chapter 2, he says, riches begin in the form of thought. Faith removes limitations. There are no limitations to the mind except those we acknowledge. Both poverty and riches are the offspring of thought. So chapter 3 is all about autosuggestion. So the medium for influencing the subconscious mind, the third step toward riches. He says you're instructed in the last of the 6 steps described in the chapter on desire to read aloud twice daily the written statement of your desire for money and to see and feel yourself already in possession of the money. By following these instructions, you communicate the object of your desire directly to your subconscious mind in a spirit of absolute faith. Through repetition of this procedure, you voluntarily create thought habits which are favorable to your efforts to transmute desire into its monetary equivalent. Awesome passage there on page 30. Do not become discouraged if you cannot control and direct your emotions the first time you try to do so. Remember, there's no such possibility as something for nothing. Continues on to say, your ability to use the principle of autosuggestion will depend very largely upon your capacity to concentrate upon a given desire until that desire becomes a burning obsession. So he talks about concentration, and on page 31, he says, be on the alert for these plans. When they appear, put them into action immediately. Inspiration. Failure to do this will be fatal to your success. This was one of the books that inspired me to do a podcast at all. So I would say this page in particular on page 31 was the direct inspiration for everything I've done with real estate and researching and communicating it on this platform. So awesome stuff there. And then on page 32, He says, then you will have arrived at the point where you may truly say, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Love that quote. He says, after you've read the entire book, come back to this chapter on chapter 3 and follow in spirit and in action the instruction. So chapter 4 discusses specialized knowledge. So specialized knowledge in regards to personal experiences or observations, the 4-step toward riches. He says on page 34, knowledge will not attract money unless it is organized and intelligently directed through practical plans of action to the definite end of accumulation of money. Page 35, through the assistance of his mastermind group, Henry Ford had at the command all of the specialized knowledge he needed to enable him to become one of the wealthiest men in America. It was not essential that he have this knowledge in his own mind. Surely no person who has sufficient inclination and intelligence to read a book of this nature can possibly miss the significance of this illustration. So he likes to talk about Henry Ford a lot early on in the book and other famous people, but this one in particular discussing a mastermind group. And you hear this happen in many entrepreneur circles, and successful businessmen have their own mastermind groups that often you have to pay to get in, but people like Alex Hormozy exaggerate the success that can be derived from attending these meetings, even if you have to pay for them. So love that section. So then page 41, he says, I am also trying to emphasize another point, namely that both success and failure are largely the results of habit. So reminds me of Atomic Habits, James Clear. Okay, so then page 42, he gives an example. He says, I brought parental pressure to bear and induced him to accept the place with Mr. Halpin because I believe that close association with one who refuses to compromise with circumstances he does not like is an asset that can never be measured in terms of money. He discusses organized planning. And then at the end of this chapter on page 43, he says, because of this very truth, there is universal demand and an ever-increasing opportunity for the person capable of helping men and women to sell their personal services advantageously. Capability means imagination, the one quality needed to combine specialized knowledge with ideas in the form of organized plans designed to yield riches. So continuing on to chapter 5, he discusses the workshop of the mind, the 5th step toward riches. He talks about synthetic imagination and creative imagination, the differences between the two. Continuing on, how to make practical use of imagination, what I would do if I had $1 million. So he talks about an example there. He talks about, quote here, ideas can be transmuted into cash through the power of definite purpose plus definite plans. Another quote on the same page, the creator of ideas makes his own price and, if he is smart, gets it. Page 52, success requires no explanations. Failure permits no alibis. Probably my favorite quote in the book. A lot of self accountability here. On chapter 6, he discusses organized planning, the crystallization of desire and action, the 6th step toward riches. So again, he talks about making use of the mastermind principle. He says to arrange to meet members of your mastermind group at least twice a week, if you can. And then your achievement can be no greater than your plans are sound. He says no follower of this philosophy can reasonably expect to accumulate a fortune without experiencing temporary defeat. A quitter never wins and a winner never quits. Talks about on page 55, the major attributes of leadership. The following are important factors of leadership. He talks about unwavering courage, self-control, keen sense of justice, definiteness of decision, definiteness of plans, the habit of doing more than paid for, pleasing personality, sympathy and understanding, mastery of detail, and then very important here, willingness to assume full responsibility, and then 11, cooperation. He discusses on page 57 the 10 major causes of failure in leadership. People unwilling to delegate, inability to organize details, expectation of pay for what they know instead of what they do with that which they know, and then fear of competition from followers, lack of imagination, selfishness, intemperance, disloyalty, emphasis of authority, of leadership, emphasis of title. So A lot to unpack in this chapter, but very important, I think, in business settings in the corporate world. On page 64, he talks about a QQS rating. This was interesting, quality and quantity and sort in which it is rendered. Interesting. And then, so quality, quantity, and spirit of service, rather. Page 66, he says the 30 major causes of failure. Excuse me. How many of these are holding you back? So I had to do a checklist on this one just to like hold myself accountable. But I really like this part because he says, I'll just go through them quick. Number 1, unfavorable hereditary background. 2, lack of a well-defined purpose in life. 3, lack of ambition to aim above mediocrity. 4, insufficient education, which a lot of us have in some areas, keeping us back. 5, lack of self-discipline. That was an area that I explored a lot in the year 2022. And I think I've gotten a lot farther with my life by practicing self-discipline. 6, ill health. 7, unfavorable environmental influences during childhood. 8, procrastination. 9, lack of persistence. 10, negative personality. 11, lack of control of sexual urges. 12, uncontrolled desire for something for nothing. 13, lack of a well-defined power of decision. 14, one or more of the 6 basic fears. 15, wrong selection of a mate in a marriage. 16, overcaution. 17, wrong selection of associates in business. 18, superstition and prejudice. 19, wrong selection of a vocation. 20, lack of concentration or effort. And it goes on. I mean, there's so many of these. I could keep going. I did underline a quote here. Be sure that you are worth more than you now receive. Page 70, take inventory of yourself. So he gives another 28 questions you should answer. These are really powerful questions on page 70 and 71. I highly recommend taking time to read those if you're going to read this book, especially in this section. He says on page 72, freedom to accumulate and own without change all the property we can accumulate. And then page 76, you should know the full truth concerning this freedom of which so many people boast. And so if you understand, as great as it is, as far as it reaches, as many privileges as it provides, it is not a pretty sight. It did not increase our respect for mob psychology, through which men cast reason to the winds and start trying to get without giving. So chapter 7 on page 77, lack of decision is one of the major causes of failure. Reaching decisions promptly is important. Acquire these facts or secure the information you need quietly without disclosing your purpose. Let one of your first decisions be to keep a closed mouth and open ears and eyes. I'm going to skip ahead. I just have so much in this chapter. Chapter 8, persistence. So the sustained effort necessary to induce faith, the 8th step toward riches. Every failure brings with it the seed of an equivalent advantage. Symptoms of lack of persistence on page 89. He has 16 examples. And then continuing on to page 91, another great quote: the only break anyone can afford to rely upon is self-made break. These come through the application of persistence. The starting point is definiteness of purpose. How to develop persistence. He goes into 4 major steps that you can do so to do that. On page 94, he says, as one makes an impartial study of the prophets, philosophers, miracle men, and religious leaders of the past, one is drawn to the inevitable conclusion that persistence, concentration of effort, and definiteness of purpose, again, were the major sources of their achievements. So I love that. He mentions that several times throughout the book. So chapter 9, power of the mastermind, driving force. 9th step toward riches. Power is required for the accumulation of money. Power is necessary for the retention of money after it has been accumulated. So he talks about power may be defined as organized and intelligently directed knowledge. Gaining power through the mastermind. Page 100, quote here, anybody can wish for riches, but most people do. But only a few know that a definite plan plus a burning desire for wealth are the only dependable means of accumulating wealth. Love that. Chapter 10, the mysteries of sex transmutation. This is a kind of a weird chapter, but it's kind of an interesting one. Just kind of talks about human nature and subduing urges and things like that. But it talks about irresistible force, immovable body, the 10 mind stimuli, genius is developed through the sixth sense. A lot of quotes in this one. I'm going to skip over this chapter just because it's kind of, it's uncomfortable to talk about out loud, but I think it's still a very good section. In chapter 11, the subconscious mind, the connecting link, the 11th step toward riches, the subconscious mind works day and night. Chapter 12, the brain. So it talks about the brain. The greatest forces are intangible, the dramatic story of the brain. Still in this chapter, page 123, adopting and following a similar plan. Any student of this philosophy may come into possession of the famous Carnegie formula briefly described in the introduction. Chapter 13 is the sixth sense, the door to the temple of wisdom. So again, building character through autosuggestion, kind of going back to earlier in the book. And then in chapter 14, how to outwit the 6 ghosts of fear. Take inventory of yourself as you read this closing chapter. Find out how many of the ghosts are standing in your way. So he talks about decisions, doubt, and fear. He talks about the 6 basic fears: poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, and death. Fears are nothing more than states of mind. So got a section here that says money talks, symptoms of fear and poverty. And then symptoms of fear and loss. He talks about this a lot throughout the book, but page 147 is a self-analysis of test questions you can ask yourself to help understand your fears. Page 149, your mind is your spiritual estate. Mind control is the result of self-discipline and habit. And then so really just a great overall book. Think and Grow Rich. I've heard a lot of successful entrepreneurs, real estate agents, real estate investors have read this book, and it was recommended to me by so many different people, but I finally just gave it a read and loved it. So I'd highly recommend this book. A+, super score, 10 out of 10, would recommend. So if you enjoyed today's podcast, video, please like, subscribe, share with anyone you know that can benefit from this. Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. Again, bippity boppity investment property. Let's go.